Hello, I'm John Paul and I'm here at RimmerBros to fit front disc pads on this 1981 MGBGT. First I'm going to take the wheel off. As you can see, it's got the wire wheels on with the centre hub nut. You can see it's given you quite clear instruction on the outside, so it says this is on the right side, which obviously is, and it says undo that way. So this is in effect a left hand thread nut, so we'll have to get our spanner on it and you just give it a tap and spin the nut off. Then you just pull the wheel off the splines, nice and steady. There we are, and there we can see the spigot mount hub for the wheel, the caliper and the disc. And first thing we're going to do is pull out the brake pads and remove the caliper. Fairly simple to remove the brake pads. We've got the split pin type arrangements with the anti-rattle washers behind them, so you just have to use some decent pliers, and if you just crimp up the split pin so they're straight, quick tap, and then pull the split pin out and remove the little shim. Do that top and bottom, and then we'll be able to remove the brake pads. And to remove the brake pads, you just give them a wiggle, pull them out. So them out of the way, we can now undo the two caliper bolts. Now this is a classic car, so I'm sure you're all used to using imperial spanners because we are going to need some for this. There's just two mounting bolts on the back. They're a 5/8 spanner size, and there's two lock tab washers. These have still got the original lock tab, so you just have to get a little chisel, bend the lock tabs up, then you can get your sockets on to undo the caliper bolts. Here's the caliper removed, just the two 5/8 spanners bolts, and then here's the lock tab. I said you just have to bend that lock tab over because it just goes onto the edge of the bolt to stop it coming undone. So once that's out of the way, we can now move our attention to taking the disc off. Because this has got the wire wheel conversion kit on, you can see right down the centre is the cap that covers the bearing and the hub nut. So we need to get that cap off so we can get to the split pin to take the castellated nut off, to get the bearing to pull the hub off. So that ideally it would be nice if you had a slide hammer with a 5/16 UNF conversion thread, so you can slide it onto that the nut there, and then you can slide hammer the cap off. Alternatively, if you haven't got one, you'll just need to screw a 5/16 UNF nut onto the thread there, and then you should be able to just get a couple of screwdrivers and just edge it side to side and get the cap off. So I've wound the nut onto the threaded part of the hub cap, then just a couple of screwdrivers, just wiggle it side to side until you can get the cap out. Now with the cap out, we then need, down the centre you'll see the split pin through the castellated nut. There's a hole in the hub itself, so if you line the hole up with the top of the split pin, you'll be able to bend the bottom part of the split pin straight, lever it up and take it out of the hole in the hub. Now to remove the hub nut, you'll need an 1.1/8" socket down the centre, undo the nut, and once that's off and out of the way, we'll be able to slide the whole disc and stub, pop out the wheel bearing. We'll inspect the wheel bearing in a second to see whether it needs replacing. To remove the hub from the disc, there's just these four the 3/8 UNF bolts, those 9/16 spanner size. I mean, if you haven't got an impact wrench like this one, which is quite nice, if you haven't got one of those, you're replacing the disc anyway, so you can clamp that in the vise and undo it with a spanner or a socket. Once you put in the new disc on, obviously protect the new disc if you are clamping it in the vise. These are nuts and bolts that hold the hub to the disc, so if you just tap all four of them through, and then you can pull the hub from the disc, and then when we're going to replace it, we're going to put new nuts and bolts on. If you're not going to replace the wheel bearings, just push the inner race onto its face and just turn it around. If you feel any roughness, you'll have to pull the seal out and check the bearing properly. On the outer bearing, which we can see, you can just you can clean all the rollers, make sure there's no pitting on any of those, And the same again, you can get a light, you can have a look at the inner race, and just to make sure there's no pitting. If there is any pitting or any roughness, then obviously you're going to fit new bearings. And just before we rebuild the bearing, we're just going to pack it with grease. But now we're going to put the disc onto the hub. Now we're going to fit the disc to the hub. So you pop the bolt through one of the holes, put the hub in place, your spring washer on, and your nut. So do that to all four, and then we'll tighten them up. That's all four of our nuts tightened up on the hub to the disc. Now we couldn't find a really decent torque setting for these in the manual, so I mean there are 3/8 UNF bolts, so I'd imagine 45 Newton meters would be absolutely fine for that. You certainly don't want them much tighter than that. Now then, we're just going to pop the hub onto the stub and fit the outer bearing. Now when you come to tighten up the outer bearings, as we're replacing same for same, and there's a tube in between the two centres of the bearing, you'll just tighten it up, tighten the big nut up to a relatively tight torque setting, probably, I don't know, probably about 50 Newton meters. But as these are taper roller bearings, generally you do have a little bit of play in them, but because they've got the tube in between the two inner bearings, then you will tighten the nut up hard. So yeah, 50 Newton meters will be absolutely fine. So I've tightened the castellated hub nut up, give it a spin, make sure it feels right, nothing's too tight, nothing's too loose, so it's just about right. And then we can replace the split pin through the castellated nut, so we can go through the hole in the hub stub axle there, straight through. Obviously you've got to line up the castellated nut with the hole in the stub axle, put that in, bend it all so the split pin's not going to come out, and then we can replace the hub nut. So if you slide it down there, probably the best way to do it is just get your socket, an extension, and just tap it into place. So that's all nice. So that's a bit done. We can clean the disc now and replace the caliper. I'm going to clean the disc up with brake cleaner. So I'm going to clean the Mac bit first and the front. I've just done that. Give it a good wipe, get all the grease off, both back and front, and then we can put it into a lock and replace the caliper. Before I replace the caliper, I'm just going to put the piston pusher backer tool in, and then push the pistons back in all the way. That's that. And now we're ready to refit the caliper. When you're fitting the caliper, it's best to fit the new tab washer as well. So obviously you can see the bolt go through the hole. Once it's tightened up, the little tab washer at the top, you bend it over and knock it tight onto the bolt, and that just prevents it coming loose at any stage. Got new bolts and tab washers, so we're just going to replace the caliper, tighten the bolts up to 45 to 55 Newton meters. And then you just bend the tabs over so it goes back onto the head of the bolt, and that's your anti-lock system. Now I'm going to fit the new brake pads. Just put a little bit of copper grease on each side, push them in, make sure they're nice and square, bit of copper grease again, place them back in like that. And these got the split pin and washer for the anti-rattle, so put the shim in first, and you feed the split pin through all the way through as it goes through the other side hole. Do that top and bottom, and then all you need to do is make sure once they're all the way through, just bend over the end of the split pin so that is the locking mechanism for the pads. So that's all back together now. New discs, new pads, everything's checked, so it's all good. Now it's just time to replace the wheel. So just line it up onto the splines and then put our cap back on, obviously opposite to the way we undid it. So that's tight. We get our knocker spanner, and then this wants to be fairly tight. I mean, obviously there's no torque, so I think it's just hitting it with a hammer, but There we are, all done.